In this presentation, we're going to look at a topic that can confuse even experts: how to determine if a project is quality improvement, evidence-based practice, or research. The first thing we have to address is why this question is even important. Many might look at the question and say, I'm a bedside nurse, this doesn't affect me. But in fact, the bedside nurse is pivotal in all three endeavors. As we worked through the EBP process, when we came to implementation, we needed to answer the question of whether we needed IRB approval or not. Though we may be clear in our minds that we are doing an EBP project and not research, the distinction is not always so clear. So one of the reasons we need to differentiate is to determine if IRB approval is needed for our project. We have an ethical obligation to protect human subjects, guard the rights of individuals, and shield confidential data such as personal medical information, especially if our goal is to present, publish, or otherwise widely disseminated work. An IRB review may be a required step for conference or journal acceptance. Secondly, the goals and methods of the approaches are different, so it's critical to understand which approach is needed in any given situation. While the goals of research are new knowledge generation, the goals of EBP process is to translate evidence to change practice, and the goal of quality improvement is to improve patient care. The rigor of the methods differ as well. Rigor is the scientific merit, difficulty, and attention to detail that a project entails. It is directly tied to the quality of evidence produced and the confidence a practitioner can have in the results. Though there may be some overlap in projects based on the aims and methods, quality improvement has the least rigor. EBP has a moderate amount, and research has the highest level of rigor and is always considered the highest form of evidence. Though we may be clear in our minds that we are doing an EBP or QI project and not research, the federal definition is broader. It defines research as a systematic investigation including research development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Activities which meet this definition constitute research for purposes of this policy, whether or not they are conducted or supported under a program which is considered research for other purposes. So clearly, simply labeling something QI or EBP does not protect it from possibly needing to be assessed by an institutional review board. Likewise, the federal definition of a human subject is a living individual about whom an investigator, whether professional or student, conducting research obtains data through intervention or interaction with the individual or identifiable private information. Again, simply labeling something as QI or EBP does not mitigate the fact that these projects may be involving human subjects in an investigative enterprise and need to be properly reviewed. Let's take a look at each approach specifically to see what it entails and how they differ. Though informal research has existed since the first humans began interacting with their world and used trial and error to figure out how to find food and avoid danger, the formalized process of research did not begin in earnest until the 17th century, when alchemists and scientists first recognized the need to approach questions in a systematic way. They used the scientific method as a process of generating new knowledge or actually creating evidence through the conduct of experiments that began with the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses based on systematic observation, measurement, and experimentation. Even among physicians, Florence Nightingale is recognized as the first medical researcher, as she was the first to apply these methods to improving the care of populations of people, in her case, soldiers in the Crimean War. Because data is usually collected at the identifiable individual level, a research study will always require an IRB review, though varying designs will necessitate different types of review. The rigor or scientific merit, difficulty, and attention to detail is very high for research. The research process begins with the delineation of a research problem or question. Then a review of the literature is done. Though the literature review as reported within research study often seems abbreviated, a research study literature review should have the same depth and rigor as a systematic review. The goal is to identify what is known about the issue and what is not known, called the gaps in knowledge. Based on results from the literature review and the gaps identified, the researcher formulates a testable hypothesis, designs a study, and then implements the study to collect data. After all the data is collected, it is analyzed and interpreted, and the results are written up for presentation and publication. Research findings generally answer one question, but generate additional new questions, so the process starts again. Evidence-based practice is the use of the best evidence available in the care of patients. Though even back in ancient times, practitioners likely tried to base their care on the best evidence they had. Evidence-based practice as a systematic entity is relatively new. The term did not come into general use until the 1990s, when Sackett and colleagues promulgated the first formal definition and began standardizing the approach. EBP uses PICO questions to identify the population, interventions, comparisons, outcomes, and timeframes to be assessed. Unlike research, which generates new knowledge, the purpose of an EBP project is to translate evidence by critically appraising it and then using it to make changes to practice. It goes beyond research evidence and encompasses all evidence that might be used to inform a clinical decision, including external evidence such as research, internal evidence such as QI and patient preferences and values. Data may be individual or institutional level, so depending upon how data is collected, stored, and disseminated, an IRB review is sometimes needed. Though it varies by project, the rigor or scientific merit, difficulty, and attention to detail is usually moderate for EBP projects. The EBP process is also divided into steps. Depending upon the source, this may be as few as 4 steps or as many as 9. Regardless of how the steps are grouped and labeled, they all follow the same basic sequence of activities. We are using Melnick and Feinout-Overholt's model, where there are even steps labeled 0 through 6. The first step is to cultivate a spirit of inquiry within the environment. Next, you need to ask the burning clinical question in the specific PICO format. This is followed by searching for and collecting the most relevant and best evidence, critically appraising the evidence, and then integrating the best evidence with one's clinical expertise and patient preferences and values in order to make a practice decision. The final steps are implementing the change and evaluating its outcomes, and then disseminating the outcomes of the evidence-based change. Quality improvement as a formal process started in industry as a way to decrease the number of production errors and increase the consistency of manufactured goods. Though there were pockets of quality assessment in healthcare, this model wasn't taken up with any consistency by institutions until the government programs for Medicare and Medicaid began forcing reforms in the healthcare industry in the late 60s. Other insurers followed, and gradually quality moved from being merely a forced activity to being embraced as an integral part of proper care. The Institute of Medicine defines quality as the degree to which health services for individuals and populations increase the likelihood of desired health outcomes and are consistent with current professional knowledge. Quality assessment, or QA, and quality improvement, or QI, use methods similar to the nursing process to assess interventions and outcomes. Plan, do, check, act, and focus PDSA are common mnemonics for the process of planning, implementing, assessing, and evaluating. The purpose of quality improvement is to improve patient care. It uses a systematic approach to improve processes or outcomes by clearly defining the outcome of interest, setting a criteria that needs to be met, and determining how to measure the outcome. With the criteria so specifically set, QI generally does not require the same all-encompassing literature review of research and EBP. It is more focused on measuring to determine if a criteria is met. QI data is usually aggregate in nature, and it is usually institution-specific in its reach. Therefore, an IRB review is very rarely required. Though it varies by project, the rigor or scientific merit, difficulty, and attention to detail is minimal for QI. Like EBP and research, there are multiple descriptions of the steps in the QI process. Plan, do, check, act, the most commonly used steps in the EBP process, originated in the business world. Again, the process is similar to research and EBP. In the planning phase, the goals and objectives are set and the known criteria identified. In the do phase, the plan is implemented, and in the act phase, the outcome is evaluated. If the results of the evaluation in the check step show that the criteria was met, then the standard of care continues with the same goals and objectives, which are reevaluated periodically to assure continued compliance. If the criteria was not met, then the plan cycle starts again. So for example, a QI project might plan measuring the fall rate on a unit with a criteria of no more than 6 falls in a month. The measurement plan is implemented and then the result is evaluated. If the result shows less than 6 falls, then the criteria is met and the unit might decide to simply reevaluate in a year to make sure they are still on track. If, however, there are more than 6 falls, then the plan phase starts again, perhaps remeasuring to check a second month or perhaps implementing an EBP project to change some practices before doing a reevaluation. Here is a graphic representation to help you visualize some of the potential interrelationships of EBP, QI, and research. In this example, as potential issue is identified, if there is a known criteria that needs to be met, then a QI project can be implemented to assess it. If the result of the QI project is that the criteria is met, no further action is needed. However, if the criteria is not met, or if the original issue had no existing criteria, then a systematic review of the literature needs to be performed to identify all known evidence on the issue. If there is adequate evidence, an EBP project can be undertaken to attempt to apply the correct knowledge to the situation. If there is not adequate knowledge, then research is necessary first to generate enough evidence to begin an EBP translation. So to summarize, the goals and methods of these 3 approaches to problem solving are different, so it's critical to understand which approach is needed in any given situation. While the goal of research is new knowledge generation through the collection of individual data with high rigor, the goal of the EBP process is to translate evidence to change practice and may involve individual or institutional level data and moderate rigor. The goal of quality improvement is to improve patient care, and data is usually collected at the institutional or aggregate level with a minimal level of rigor. Regardless of the label given to the project, each specific project should be assessed to determine if IRB approval is needed. One of the first duties of nurses is the protection of the patient's rights, and nurses should always be vigilant to this. Best practice is to always have the IRB itself make the determination if review is needed for every single project. It's better to check and find that review is not needed than to ignore the process only to find too late that a major ethical breach has occurred. This has been a brief introduction to differentiating QI, EBP, and research. If you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to contact your instructor.